My parents left me with my grandmother when I was 10, and now that my grandmother has died and I am 19, they have returned. It happened when I was 10, on one of those boiling hot August days in the suburbs of Cleveland, the kind where the air feels sticky and the sun just won't let up. I remember the smell of my dad's car, old leather and a faint hint of spearmint gum, mixed with the scratchy sound of some old country station playing way too loud through his busted speakers. My parents were acting weird, not yelling or anything, just off. My mom was too cheerful, the kind of cheerful that didn't match the mood, like she was trying too hard. And my dad, who usually drove in dead silence except for an occasional grunt or mutter, kept cracking bad jokes and tapping the steering wheel to the beat like he was performing for a crowd that didn't exist. I didn't have much with me. Just my blue backpack with a fading Batman patch on it, my tablet, the charger wrapped tightly with a rubber band, and my favorite gray hoodie that smelled like laundry and a little bit of our dog, Scout. No one said why we were going to Grandma's, which wasn't totally strange. We went there sometimes during school breaks, but this felt different. Everything about the drive was tense beneath the surface, like there was something important no one wanted to say. When we pulled into Grandma's driveway, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. My mom reached back and patted my knee, smiling too hard, and said, "You go ahead, sweetheart. We'll be right in." I hesitated, because we always went in together. Always. But I got out of the car like I was told, and went to the door, knocking the way Grandma always told me to so she could turn down her TV. She opened the door like she'd been expecting me, not excited, just prepared. That was the second weird thing. No surprised smile, no arms wide open for a hug, just a short, quiet, "Come in, Michael," and a glance over my shoulder toward the car. I walked into the house, the familiar smell of cinnamon and mothballs wrapping around me like a blanket I didn't want to be under. I remember looking back through the screen door and seeing my parents still in the car. But then, just as I was about to ask Grandma what was going on, they got out. My mom straightened her blouse like she was going to an interview, and my dad pulled his baseball cap lower over his eyes. They came inside, barely a minute behind me, but they didn't take off their shoes or sit down. They stood in the kitchen with Grandma while I lingered in the hallway, half hidden behind the edge of the wall. I heard low voices, tense. Grandma saying, "Are you sure about this?" And my dad mumbling, "It's for the best." I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew something was wrong. My mom came over, crouched down so we were eye to eye, and said, "Hey, buddy, Grandma's going to take care of you for a little while, okay?" She smiled, but her eyes were glassy, like she'd been crying before we arrived or was about to start. I asked, "Where are you going?" And she hesitated just a second too long. "Just to the store," she said. "We'll be back soon." But I knew she was lying. Even at 10 years old, I could feel the kind of lie that sits heavy in your chest. They left not long after that. No hugs, no promises, just an awkward silence and a door that closed too quietly for what it meant. I ran to the window and watched them drive off, the car disappearing down the long gravel driveway that felt like it had never been so long until that moment. I stood there for a long time, waiting for the car to turn around, for them to come back, for someone to tell me this was a joke, a test, a misunderstanding. They never came back. That was the day I learned what abandonment feels like, not in the way people describe in books, but in the way it settles into your bones and makes everything afterward feel just a little colder. Grandma didn't say much that first night. She made mac and cheese from scratch and didn't ask questions when I barely touched it. She let me keep my backpack on my lap during dinner and even cleared my plate for me without a word. I slept in the guest room that night, the one with the squeaky bed and the lamp that buzzed when it was on too long. I kept the tablet on my chest, watching some dumb cartoon I didn't care about, waiting for the headlights to appear outside the window. They didn't. And for a long time after that, neither did they. The first few hours after they left, I sat on the guest room bed with my tablet on my lap, half playing some game I didn't really care about, my fingers moving without thinking. Every so often, I'd pause and go to the living room window, pulling back the lace curtain just enough to peek out, expecting to see our old silver Honda rolling back up the driveway. I thought maybe they just needed to grab something important, or maybe they had a flat tire, or maybe, just maybe, this whole thing was a mistake. My grandmother tried to act like everything was normal. She made oatmeal the way she always did, with raisins and too much cinnamon, and she turned on the radio in the kitchen like she wasn't waiting for someone to come back. But I could tell from the way she checked the clock or stared a little too long at the front door that she didn't believe they were coming back either. Still, she kept saying it. "They'll be back soon, Michael." Like if she said it enough, maybe it would come true. The next day, and the day after that, she kept me on my routine. We woke up at the same time. She made sure I brushed my teeth, even though I didn't really care whether I did or not. She sat with me while I watched cartoons in the morning, asking if I wanted to play outside, but I just shook my head. I didn't want to leave the front window. What if they came while I was gone? A week passed. I counted the days by the number of times we had meatloaf for dinner, which was always on Tuesdays. I was still using the same backpack from before, still wearing the same hoodie I had in the car when they dropped me off. Grandma offered to take me shopping, said I might feel better with some new things. I nodded, because I didn't know what else to do. We went to the store one afternoon, and I remember walking down the school supply aisle and seeing a display of lunchboxes. There was one with puppies on it, golden retriever puppies stacked in a basket, and she asked if I liked it. I shrugged, but she bought it anyway. She also took care of some paperwork that I didn't understand at the time. I just remember sitting next to her in the front office of the local elementary school while she handed over some papers with her name on them and told them I'd be living with her for a while. I didn't correct her because I didn't know how long a while really meant. I just sat there gripping the lunchbox in my lap and thinking about how different everything looked in that office, how none of the faces were familiar, and how the hallways didn't smell like my old school. By the time I actually started going to class, almost 2 weeks had passed. Nobody said anything about why I was starting late, at least not in front of me. I had a new name tag on my desk, and one of the kids in class asked if I had just moved from another state. I nodded even though I hadn't. The teacher smiled a little too much and talked to me like I didn't know how to read. I didn't correct her either. Every afternoon after school, I sat by the window in the front room while Grandma made dinner. I'd line up my lunchbox and backpack by the door, just in case I had to leave quickly. I kept expecting the phone to ring and for it to be them. I listened for the sound of a car pulling in, the jingle of keys in the front lock. But it was always Grandma's neighbor asking about tomatoes or a church lady dropping off something from the food pantry. By the end of that second week, I stopped going to the window as often. Not because I gave up, exactly, but because staring out into that empty gravel driveway started to hurt. Every time I saw it bare, it felt like someone was squeezing my chest a little tighter. And Grandma's voice, every time she said soon, got quieter, less confident, like even she didn't believe it anymore. I still carried that lunchbox with the puppies every day. It started to smell a little like peanut butter and hand sanitizer. I held on to it tighter than I probably should have, but it was one of the only new things in my life that didn't feel like it was going to disappear. The puppies stayed smiling. They didn't ask questions. They didn't lie. At school, I started building a wall of little stories, carefully stacked and shaped to keep everything else out. I told anyone who asked that my parents were traveling, just for a bit, some business thing that came up last minute. I said they were sending postcards and checking in every night, that everything was fine, just busy, just temporary. The more I said it, the more automatic it became, like pressing play on a recording I didn't want to hear anymore. Nobody really questioned it. Most kids didn't care enough to press, and the teachers, if they noticed anything odd, kept it to themselves. But inside, I felt like I was carrying a heavy backpack that no one else could see. The truth sat in the pit of my stomach, growing heavier every day, and the worst part was pretending it didn't exist. At recess, I laughed when I was supposed to. I played Foursquare or hung around the monkey bars just to look normal, but my mind was always somewhere else, usually back at that driveway, back at the car pulling away without a backward glance. It wasn't until the second week at school that someone finally asked a real question. Cindy, a girl in my class with too many stickers on her lunchbox and braids tied up with neon scrunchies, leaned over during reading time and whispered, "Hey, who's picking you up now?" She didn't ask it in a mean way. She just seemed curious, like she was trying to figure out how I fit into the picture everyone else already understood. I didn't even hesitate. I looked up from my book and said, "I'm just temporarily staying with my grandma. My parents are coming back soon." I said it in the same tone you'd use to mention a dentist appointment or a lost mitten. Harmless, forgettable. Cindy nodded like that made perfect sense and went back to her chapter about dolphins. But inside, something cracked. Because I knew. I already knew that the word temporary didn't mean what it used to. It had started out like a light switch in my head, something that might flip back on at any time. Now it just flickered in the dark, not quite dead, but not reliable either. The hardest part wasn't the lying. It was the pretending I still believed what I was saying. Every morning, I packed that same puppy lunchbox. Every afternoon, Grandma would wait in the pickup line with her soft eyes and quiet smile. And I'd walk to her car, trying not to look at the other kids hugging their moms or running up to their dads. I made myself stop counting how many days it had been since I last heard their voices. I told myself they'd call, that maybe they didn't have good service, that they were just too busy right now to check in. But I also started noticing things around Grandma's house that didn't match the story I kept telling. Like the fact that she'd cleared out the bottom drawer in her bedroom for my clothes. Or how the toothbrush I used was no longer just borrowing space in the bathroom. It had its own cup now, next to hers. One night, I caught her on the phone with someone, whispering in the hallway, and I only caught part of it. No, nothing yet, she said, and then, quieter, I'm just doing my best with him. He still asks. I didn't ask her about it. I just went back to watching TV with the volume low. That's how everything felt then, turned down, muted, like I was living behind a sheet of glass. At school, I kept the stories up. I smiled when people asked how my weekend was. I said we baked cookies, or watched movies, or drove out to a pumpkin patch. None of it was true. Sometimes I just said what I remembered from before, like a rerun of my old life that no one else knew had ended. The teachers started calling Grandma's number instead of my mom's when there was a question about homework or a permission slip. I pretended not to notice when her handwriting showed up on the forms in my backpack. I didn't want to see the shift happening, but I felt it in everything. The silence from my parents, the weight of the lies, the quiet ache behind my ribs that wouldn't go away no matter how many stories I told. And yet, every day, I kept showing up. I kept talking. I kept lying. Because if I stopped, I wasn't sure what would be left. The first letter came in a yellowed envelope with bent corners and a Georgia postmark that looked smudged, like it had traveled too far and taken its time doing it. My grandmother didn't say anything when she opened it. I watched her from the hallway as she read it at the kitchen table, holding it with both hands like it might tear apart if she wasn't careful. Her lips moved slightly as she read, and then she folded the letter back up and tucked it into one of the drawers near the fridge where she kept coupons and old recipes. She didn't look at me when I asked who it was from. She just said, "They're fine, they'll be in touch soon," and that was it. But I saw the return address. It said somewhere in Georgia, and I knew we didn't have family there. Not unless my parents had gone there after leaving me. The second letter came a week later, and then another a few days after that. Each one said almost nothing. Just short sentences, strange phrases like, "We're figuring things out," and "Tell him to be good," and "Everything will be fine soon." No details, no explanations, no mention of why they left or when they were coming back. The handwriting looked like it came from a child, big loopy letters that didn't seem like my dad's at all, and definitely not my mom's neat cursive. It was like they were pretending to write like someone else, or like they weren't sure what to say and didn't want to say too much. I asked my grandma once if I could read one. She paused for a second, then said she had already thrown it away, even though I knew I'd seen her slide it into that drawer. After that, I stopped asking. Instead, I waited until she left the house or was in the backyard hanging laundry, and I checked the mail before she could. Most days there was nothing but bills and catalogs. But on the days something came from Georgia, I'd feel it before I even saw the envelope, like a cold rush of air down my back. She always hid them, always said nothing, and always looked tired afterward. What I remember even more than the letters were the phone calls. They came late, always after I was supposed to be asleep. The house was old and didn't keep sound in very well, so from my room down the hall I could hear her voice. Low, tense, careful. I don't know who she was talking to every time, but I knew the rhythm of those calls. The creak of the floorboards as she paced near the kitchen. The soft tap of her nails on the countertop. Her voice barely above a whisper. "He's asking about you again," she would say, and then after a pause, "It's your child, Rachel. You don't get to pretend he doesn't exist." Sometimes she would cry. Not loudly. Not the kind of sobs that shake a room, but the quiet kind that leave you with nothing left afterward. The kind that sound like giving up. Other times, her voice got hard, clipped words that ended fast. "No, that's not good enough. I don't care what he says. You're her mother." After those calls, she wouldn't speak much for the rest of the day. She'd move through the house with stiff movements, like her joints had all tightened. Her face would settle into this look I didn't recognize, distant, heavy, like everything around her was covered in dust. I learned not to ask on those days. I learned to make my own cereal and keep the TV volume low. She still made dinner, but we'd sit in silence, the clink of forks on plates the only sound in the room. At night, I started pretending to be asleep even when I wasn't. I'd lie there in bed, the puppy lunchbox still by my door, and I'd stare at the ceiling, waiting to hear her voice again, hoping maybe this time, the call would end with something different. That she'd come into my room afterward and tell me they were coming to get me. That it was finally time to go home. But she never did. She just hung up the phone, turned off the kitchen light, and walked down the hall to her room. The door would close gently behind her, and that would be the end of it. And still, every morning, I'd get up, pack my bag, and go to school like none of it was happening. Because that's what I'd learned to do. Wait quietly, lie carefully, and carry around a truth that no one wanted to say out loud. Grandma's house had a stillness to it, like everything inside had stopped moving a long time ago and was just waiting to be remembered. The air always smelled faintly of soap and mothballs, not in a fresh way, but in the way of closets that hadn't been opened in years. Every surface was covered with knitted napkins, some white, some faded yellow, a few with flowers stitched into the corners, and I learned quickly not to move them unless I wanted to hear about how things are meant to stay where they belong. The carpets were old, thick, and the color of dust. Every step felt muffled. Even the walls seemed to absorb sound, like the whole house was doing its best to keep things quiet. Sometimes I walked from room to room just to make sure I still existed, but the silence followed me everywhere. I became part of it, a shadow that drifted past doilies and curtains and bowls of hard candy no one ate. I didn't slam doors or leave lights on anymore. I tiptoed because the house felt like it was holding its breath. My grandmother tried. I could see it in the way she straightened her back whenever I walked into a room, how she asked if I wanted seconds even when I hadn't touched the first plate. One afternoon she made mac and cheese, told me it was the kind I used to love. But it wasn't. The noodles were too soft, the cheese too sharp, and it didn't come out of a blue box. I stared at the bowl, trying not to cry, but it tasted like the wrong version of something I used to know. She sat across from me, not saying much, just watching with tight lips and a fork she didn't use. That night, I left my sneakers by the front door instead of putting them in the closet like she asked. I was tired and distracted, and I guess I forgot. The next morning, she found them, and her voice snapped like a twig. "I told you. Shoes go in the closet, Michael," she said, and it hit me hard, sharp and cold, like she wasn't just scolding me for the shoes but for everything I didn't know how to fix. I nodded and went to get them, but I felt the tears start before I even reached the mat. I didn't cry loud. I just stood in the hallway with my back to her, trying to blink it away. I didn't expect anything after that, just silence, maybe the clink of her teacup. But instead, a few minutes later, she appeared beside me and, without saying anything, held out a lollipop. It was one of the red ones from the dish she kept in the sewing room, the kind I wasn't supposed to touch without asking. She didn't look me in the eye, just pressed it into my hand and walked away. That's how it was with her. Stern in the morning, soft in the evening. One day I'd find the sheets on my bed tucked in with military precision, and the next she'd leave a cookie on my nightstand without a word. It was like she didn't know how to be both a guardian and a grandmother, and each time she got one part right, the other slipped out of reach. And me, I floated between the rooms like I didn't quite belong in any of them. Not the kitchen with its ticking clock and stiff chairs. Not the parlor, where the TV was too loud and always playing the weather. Not even my bedroom, which still smelled like her guest linens and not at all like me. I stopped asking when they'd be back. I stopped counting the days. Instead, I learned the creaks in the floorboards and the time she liked to drink her tea. I learned which drawer she hid the Georgia letters in and which cabinet squeaked when you opened it too fast. I learned how to be quiet, how to sit small, and how to disappear without leaving the room. I was there, but not really. I was part of the house, just another piece of the silence. By the time I turned 13, something in me had settled into a kind of numb routine, and then quietly started to unravel. I wasn't angry in the obvious way, not throwing tantrums or screaming at doors. I was the kind of angry that seeps in slowly, like water soaking into drywall, silent, invisible, until everything starts to sag. School stopped making sense to me. The bells, the worksheets, the teachers with their gentle voices pretending everything could be solved with extra credit. It all felt pointless. So I started skipping. It began with one afternoon. I told the front office I had a dentist appointment, walked out like I knew where I was going, and didn't stop until I was 2 blocks from the school, standing behind the library with a group of kids who wore their detentions like badges. They didn't care who I was or why I was there. They passed around a shared bag of chips and old jokes and moved in easy, loud rhythms that didn't expect anything from me. I sat on the curb with my skateboard resting against my knee, not saying much, just listening, just being part of something that didn't ask questions. I learned quickly how to stay in the background, how to nod instead of explain, how to throw out sarcastic one-liners when something hit too close. I'd mastered silence at home, but here, behind the chain-link fence and next to the graffiti-covered dumpster, I started learning humor as a kind of armor. If someone asked why I looked tired, I'd say I was up all night building time machines. If someone asked where I lived, I'd say on the moon, in a cardboard box with satellite reception. It worked. It made people laugh, and laughing meant no one looked too closely. But there was one day, just one, when that shield cracked. Lance, a tall kid with a mop of curly hair and a voice that hadn't settled yet, was trying to be funny. He wasn't mean, just careless, the way boys sometimes are when they're stretching the boundaries of what counts as a joke. We were skating behind the lot, trading turns trying to grind a broken bench, and he flopped onto the ground after a bad attempt. While he was laughing at himself, he looked up at me and said, "Bet your mystical parents would be proud. Wherever they are, Mars, right?" It wasn't what he said exactly. It was the word mystical, said with that smirk, like my life was some fantasy story to laugh at. Something about it broke whatever thread I'd been holding onto all day. I didn't think. I just moved. One hard shove, and he was in the bushes, face twisted in surprise, arms flailing through the branches. The laughter stopped instantly. Everyone else stared, mouths half open, and I felt the adrenaline like fire under my skin, hot and shaking. I didn't apologize. I just stood there, breathing hard, like I was trying to put myself back into my own body. Later that afternoon, I was called to the school psychologist's office. I remember the secretary looking at me like I was already some kind of problem, like my file had finally caught up with me. The office smelled like carpet cleaner and peppermint tea, and the woman who greeted me had kind eyes that I didn't trust. She asked if I wanted water. I said no. She asked what happened with Lance. I said nothing. She asked if things were okay at home. I made a joke about loving canned soup and mothballs. She didn't laugh. I sat there staring at a plastic clock on the wall while she scribbled notes on a clipboard, probably writing down words like defensive or disconnected. I didn't care. All I could think about was how fast Lance had gone down, how fast my own hands had moved, like they'd been waiting years for someone to say something just wrong enough. I didn't feel proud. I didn't even feel sorry. I just felt hollow and a little dizzy, like my body had done something my mind hadn't signed off on. That night, Grandma didn't say much. She must have gotten a call because she made meatloaf even though it wasn't Tuesday, and she gave me the bigger piece without looking me in the eye. We ate in silence. She didn't ask what happened. I didn't tell her. But when I stood up to take my plate to the sink, I saw that she'd left a cherry lollipop on the counter, the kind she always kept hidden in a cracked glass jar behind the flour. She didn't say it was for me, but I took it anyway, just like always. When I was 19, my grandmother died in the living room, in the chair she always sat in to watch her shows. It was a Sunday afternoon, and she had a blanket over her lap, the TV volume too loud like always, playing some rerun from the 60s that she'd seen 100 times before. I had just come back from the store, carrying a paper bag with eggs, dish soap, and the off-brand cereal she liked. I called her name from the kitchen, but she didn't answer, and when I stepped into the living room, she was still, her hands folded, the light from the TV flickering across her face. For a second, I thought she was asleep, and I even called her name again, softer that time, like I didn't want to wake her too suddenly. But she didn't move, and I knew. I didn't panic. I just stood there, the bag slowly sliding out of my hands, and I let the silence wrap around me. There was no dramatic reaction, no yelling or sobbing, just the quiet understanding that she was gone, and I was alone in the house we had shared for almost a decade. I sat beside her for a while. The TV kept playing, and I let it, because the thought of turning it off felt too final. I don't know how long I waited before I picked up the phone. I called Aunt Laura, even though we hadn't spoken much over the years. She answered on the second ring, and I told her what happened, calmly, like I was reporting a leak or a broken window. She gasped, asked if I was okay, and then said she would handle it. But I didn't wait for anyone else to step in. I called the funeral home myself. I picked the cheaper casket because that's what Grandma would have wanted, something simple, no frills. I went through her closet and picked the blue dress she always wore on Sundays, the one with the pearl buttons. I wrote the obituary, cleaned the house, and even cooked for the small group of neighbors and relatives who came to say goodbye. The memorial was small, quiet, a mix of people I barely knew and a few from the church who remembered Grandma as the lady with the shortbread cookies and stiff hugs. I was in the kitchen, stirring gravy I didn't really want to make, when the front door opened and voices drifted in like smoke from another life. I froze. I hadn't heard those voices in years. My mother's was the same, soft and too bright, like she was constantly trying to smooth over a mess without actually cleaning it. My father's was lower, slower, and quieter than I remembered, like he was speaking through a wall. I didn't have to go into the living room to know it was them. But I did. They were standing just inside the doorway like they belonged there, like the house hadn't aged without them. My mother spotted me first, her eyes immediately watering, her arms reaching out with this tremble in her fingers that might have been guilt or performance. I couldn't tell. "Oh, Michael," she said, stepping forward like no time had passed, like nothing needed to be explained. I stepped back. Not fast, not dramatic, but enough to close the space between us with distance she couldn't cross. Her hands dropped slightly, and her smile faltered, but she tried to hold it in place like maybe I'd change my mind if she kept pretending this was normal. My father didn't say anything. He just stood there beside her, eyes flicking over the room like he was trying to memorize the layout of a house he hadn't earned the right to stand in. No apology, no explanation, no letter, no phone call, just their presence, after 10 years of nothing, as if grief gave them permission to reappear and rewrite the past. I said nothing. I turned back toward the kitchen. There was gravy to finish, plates to arrange, people to feed. I had learned a long time ago how to keep moving. After the service, while people were still milling around the tables with their half-eaten slices of pie and quiet small talk, My mother approached me again. She walked slowly, like she thought approaching too quickly might scare me off, or like she thought she could smooth out the last decade with soft steps and a familiar smile. She stood in front of me with her hands clasped and her chin trembling just enough to be noticeable, and then she said it. Those words I'd imagined in 100 different versions, but never really expected to hear out loud. "We were always thinking about you." I stared at her, not even blinking, not looking for anything behind her eyes. I didn't nod or scoff. I just asked, calmly and clearly, "Then why did you leave me?" She flinched like I'd slapped her, her mouth opening and closing once before she stammered something about hard times and complicated situations and doing what we thought was best. My father stood behind her, stiff and silent, his hands in the pockets of his wrinkled suit, eyes fixed on the floor like it might offer him a way out of the moment. I didn't say anything else, but I didn't have to. Aunt Lori, who had been helping carry trays to the kitchen, came storming in like she'd been holding something in for too long. Her voice cut across the murmurs and clinking dishes like a blade. "You have no right to be here," she said, loud enough that the entire room went still. Heads turned. Forks froze midair. "You left him," she said, her eyes locked on my mother, then my father. "You disappeared. You didn't send money. You didn't call. You didn't even come back when she got sick. You don't get to show up now like you're grieving." My mother's face drained of color. My father took a slow step back, glancing at the room as if looking for an exit, but no one moved to help him. The relatives, the neighbors, all of them turned away just enough to make it clear where they stood. The air thickened like soup left too long on the stove, and the buzz of awkward whispers filled the space where politeness used to be. I didn't stick around for the rest of it. I walked through the front door and let it close behind me, the noise of the house fading into a blur. Outside, the cold was sharp and dry, and the wind tugged at my jacket like it wanted to carry me somewhere else. I walked to the car, leaned against the passenger door, and looked out over the edge of the driveway where the gravel met the grass. I didn't feel pain. I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel relief. Just the kind of emptiness that settles in when everything that needed to be said has already rotted in your throat for too long. I stood there, staring at nothing, while the wind moved through the bare branches and the sky held steady, dull and gray, refusing to change. About a year after the funeral, the letters started showing up again, not from Georgia this time, but from a return address just a few towns over. The handwriting was neater, more controlled, and there was no pretense of things being fine. They said things like, "We want to talk," and "We think it's time," and "We want to start over." I read them all, each one coming a little more carefully worded than the last, and I let them pile up on the kitchen counter, unopened for days at a time. Eventually, I responded, not because I thought it would fix anything, but because I wanted to see what they looked like now. I wanted to see what kind of people they'd become after vanishing from my life for almost 10 years. So I picked a diner just off the highway, a place with yellow booths, watery coffee, and a parking lot that never seemed full. They were already there when I arrived, sitting across from each other like two people who had memorized the idea of being a couple, but didn't quite remember how to perform it anymore. My mother wore a cardigan that looked new, something she probably bought just for this meeting, and my father had on the same kind of beige windbreaker he used to wear when I was a kid, only this one didn't seem to fit quite right around the shoulders. They stood up when they saw me, but I didn't hug them. I just nodded and slid into the booth. The waitress came by, refilled their mugs, and asked if I wanted anything. I ordered a burger and fries, more out of habit than hunger, and then we sat there in that strange stretch of silence where everyone waits for someone else to speak first. My mother started, her voice soft and rehearsed. She talked about guilt, about how not a day had passed without her thinking of me, about how hard it had been back then, how she had struggled with things she hadn't known how to face. She didn't say what those things were. She just let the words hang there like they were meant to be enough. My father nodded along, then leaned forward with that same look he had worn at the funeral, like he was trying to look serious, but mostly looked tired. He talked about how things were difficult, how they had no money, how they had made decisions they regretted. I listened, but I didn't hear anything I hadn't already imagined years ago. When there was a pause, when both of them looked at me like they were waiting for a sign, some crack in my expression, I said it quietly but clearly. "This is not about you anymore. This is about me." They both looked caught off guard, like the script they had brought with them didn't have a line for that. My mother blinked, her mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but I was already sliding out of the booth. I didn't touch the burger. I left it sitting on the table, still wrapped, the fries getting cold next to it. Outside, the sun had started to set, casting a weak orange glow across the hood of my car. I didn't look back when I walked across the lot. They had come for closure, maybe even forgiveness, but they were the ones who needed it, not me. I had already learned how to live without them. I'm 22 now, and I still live in my grandmother's house. It doesn't look the same anymore. The kitchen walls used to be this faded green that always made the whole place feel dim no matter how many lights were on, so I repainted them a clean, pale blue. I took out the old furniture, the heavy oak chairs and stiff floral couches that smelled like old upholstery and powdered soap, and replaced them with simple pieces I picked out myself. Nothing fancy, but mine. I pay the electricity, I take out the trash, I do the dishes by hand because the old dishwasher finally gave up for good last winter, and I didn't see the point in replacing it. I like the quiet rhythm of doing things myself. Sometimes I still hear her voice, usually at night when I forget and leave the light on in the laundry room or the hallway. "Turn off the light. It's night," she'd call from her chair, not angry, just firm in that way only she could be. It echoes in my head and makes me smile sometimes. I think about the lollipops she used to leave on the counter after we fought, the way she folded the towels with the edges perfectly aligned, how she never once told me she was scared even when I know she was. My parents still write. Every couple of months, a card or a letter shows up in the mailbox. Always some version of "Can we talk?" or "We're thinking about you." They don't press. They just send the words and leave the rest up to me. And I don't respond. Not because I'm still angry. I'm not. That burned out a long time ago, back in the years when I used to stare out the window waiting for a car that never came. Now it's something else. Now it's about the space I've carved out, the life I've managed to shape from the ruins of what they left behind. For the first time in my life, I get to decide who gets access to me. I get to choose who steps through my door, who gets to speak my name and expect an answer. And for now, I choose no one. I choose to be alone. But I also choose to be free. Thanks for reading. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were me? Do you think silence can ever say more than words? Let me know in the comments.